Have you ever been in a conversation about deeply held beliefs, uh, maybe religious, maybe philosophical, and suddenly you felt completely unequipped to explain why you actually believe what you do?
Oh, absolutely. It is a completely paralyzing moment.
Right. Like you're standing on a stage, the spotlight hits you right in the eyes, the audience is waiting, and you realize you just don't know your lines.
Yeah, you know what you feel in your gut, but articulating the rational foundation beneath it, that is an entirely different challenge.
Exactly. Or, consider the reverse. You're talking to someone whose worldview is so utterly alien to yours that you aren't even having the same conversation.
You're speaking two different languages, basically, shouting across this massive intellectual canyon.
Which is exactly why today we are getting under the hood of how we communicate, defend, and deconstruct deeply held beliefs. Welcome to another deep dive.
And we are examining a highly specific framework today, one designed to navigate those exact scenarios without the usual frustration or circular arguments.
Right, so let's get right into the sources. We're looking at a comprehensive methodology laid out in Mark Farnham's book, Every Believer Confident, specifically subtitled Apologetics for the Ordinary Christian.
Yes, and along with the main text, we are synthesizing companion study guides, some bonus theological addendums, and practical field guides.
Like that crash course in apologetics infographic.
Right, and a pocket guide for conversational questioning. The goal is to map out the exact conversational roadmap this system proposes.
Now, I want to set a very clear parameter right here at the start for you, the listener. These source materials operate from a traditional conservative Christian worldview.
Very much so. They are specifically engineered to help Christians defend their faith and lead conversations toward the gospel.
But our mission today in this deep dive is not to preach nor to, evaluate the ultimate truth of those religious claims. Whether you are a devout believer, a strict materialist, or anywhere in between, we are here to impartially dissect the intellectual machinery of this framework.
Because the mechanics of it are fascinating. We are exploring the psychology of belief, the way human beings argue, and a very specific strategy called presuppositional apologetics.
Which is a very heavy term.
Oh, it's incredibly dense. But peeling back the layers on how this methodology works reveals so much about human psychology.
Yeah, it goes far beyond just trading historical trivia or debating archaeological digs.
Exactly. It is a system built on uncovering hidden biases, understanding why people suppress information, and using diagnostic questions to dismantle worldviews from the inside out.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we're going to understand how this system deconstructs a worldview, we need to define the arena we are walking into.
Right, the definition of the terms.
Because the word apologetics gets thrown around a lot in theological circles. But out in the wild, it sounds like you were just going around apologizing for what you believe.
I know, it really does. But the linguistic root has absolutely nothing to do with saying I'm sorry. It traces back to the Greek word apologia.
Which was primarily a legal term, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. If you were standing before a magistrate in the ancient world, your apologia was your reasoned, systematic defense against the charges brought against you.
And the source material anchors this in a specific New Testament directive. I think it's 1 Peter 3.15.
That's the one. It essentially tells believers to always be prepared to give a reasoned defense for their hope.
But a defense could be built in a dozen different ways.
Yeah.
If I am defending a client in a courtroom, I could use emotional appeal or circumstantial evidence or hard forensic science.
Well, and that's where the sources get really specific. Farnham's framework actually spends a lot of time critiquing the traditional ways people try to defend the Christian worldview before introducing his own.
So what do those traditional methods look like?
Well, the landscape is usually dominated by a few major schools of thought. The first is classical apologetics.
Which is like Thomas Aquinas, right?
Exactly. This is their territory. The classical method attempts a two-step process. First, it uses pure philosophy and logic to prove that a generic God must exist.
Okay, so relying on things like the cosmological argument.
Right, the idea that every effect must have a cause, so the universe must have an ultimate uncaused first cause. And then, once they establish that a deity exists, they move to step two, attempting to prove that Jesus is the specific manifestation of that deity.
So it's very abstract. You are starting with Aristotelian logic and trying to reason your way up to a personal religion. That feels like a massive leap for, just a casual conversation at a coffee shop.
It is incredibly demanding intellectually. Most people just don't talk like that. Another major approach is evidential apologetics.
And this method operates much more like a modern courtroom, right?
Yes, it relies heavily on empirical data, so archaeological discoveries, the textual reliability of ancient manuscripts, or external historical corroboration of biblical events.
Basically trying to pile up so much probabilistic evidence that a rational jury would have to render a verdict in favor of Christianity.
That's the goal. And there is a highly distilled version of that mentioned in our sources called minimal facts apologetics, or MFA.
Minimal facts. Okay, how does that differ from the broader evidential stuff?
Well, MFA operates on the premise that you shouldn't argue over the entire Bible because that invites way too many rabbit holes.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Instead, you build your argument exclusively on the tiny handful of historical data points that almost all secular and religious scholars agree on.
For instance?
For instance, the vast majority of credentialed historians agree that a first-century figure named Jesus existed, that he was crucified by the Romans, and that shortly after his death, his followers sincerely believed they saw him alive.
Okay, so the minimal facts approach takes those undisputed points and argues that a literal resurrection is the only logical way to account for them.
Exactly.
Now, on paper, those sound like incredibly solid strategies. You use logic or you use undisputed historical facts.
Yeah.
But Farnham's critique of these methods is really sharp in the book.
It is. He argues that they suffer from a fatal foundational flaw regarding how they view the human mind.
Right, the myth of neutrality.
Yes. The central argument Farnham makes is that classical and evidential methods assume human rationality is a neutral, uncorrupted referee sitting in the brain.
Like you can just slide a perfectly constructed logical syllogism or a stack of historical documents across the table.
And the person on the other side will simply evaluate the data objectively and arrive at the Christian conclusion. Farnham argues that this completely contradicts the Christian system's own diagnosis of human nature.
So if I'm understanding the architecture here, he is saying you can't use a non-Christian premise, which is the idea that human reason is unbiased, to prove a Christian conclusion.
That is the core conflict. By stepping onto neutral ground to argue with an unbeliever, Farnham says the Christian has already surrendered the debate.
Because in this framework, there is no such thing as neutral ground.
None.
Yeah.
You are either operating from a framework where God is the source of all truth and logic, or you are operating from a framework that denies him.
Okay, so that brings us to the actual system we are analyzing today, presuppositionalism. Farnham argues that instead of presenting evidence, you have to target the opponent's underlying presuppositions.
Right.
But what does that actually look like in practice? Like, how is a presupposition different from just a regular belief?
Think of a presupposition as the precondition for how you process any knowledge at all. It is the lens through which you view reality.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, if your presupposition is that only the material, physical world exists, then when someone presents you with evidence of a miracle, you won't evaluate that evidence neutrally.
Right, because your lens forces you to seek an alternative explanation.
Exactly. You'll think maybe it was a hallucination or a yet-to-be-understood natural phenomenon. The presupposition dictates the conclusion before the evidence is even examined.
So arguing with evidential apologetics is basically like trying to convince someone a house is sturdy by showing them the nice wallpaper.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Right. Like, presuppositionalism ignores the wallpaper and immediately inspects the concrete foundation. If the foundation is sand, the house falls.
That captures the mechanics of it perfectly. Presuppositionalism forces an internal critique. Instead of lobbing historical facts at the person's worldview, you temporarily step inside their worldview.
You adopt their presuppositions for a moment and test them for internal consistency.
Right. You ask if your worldview is true, can it rationally explain the existence of logic, the reality of moral absolutes, or the uniformity of nature? You show them that their foundational commitments cannot support the weight of reality.
What's fascinating here is how the sources also refer to this method using two extremely dense terms, covenantal apologetics and transcendental apologetics.
Very dense terminology, yes.
We need to define those because they sound like pure academic jargon, but they seem mechanically crucial to how this works. Let's take transcendental first.
Okay, so a transcendental argument doesn't mean something mystical. In philosophy, a transcendental argument asks, what are the preconditions of intelligibility?
Meaning, what must be true in order for us to even be having this rational conversation?
Exactly. So if an atheist is using the laws of logic to debate a Christian, the presuppositionalist asks a transcendental question.
Like, where do those laws come from?
Right. In a random, purely material universe born out of chaos, how do immaterial, universal, unchanging laws of logic exist, and why do our brains have access to them?
Oh, wow. So it points out that the skeptic is relying on the Christian worldview, an orderly universe created by a rational mind, in order to argue against it.
Yes, they are borrowing capital from the system they are trying to dismantle.
And what about the term covenantal?
The covenantal aspect relies on the theological idea that no human being is an autonomous, independent observer. According to this framework, every single person is already in a binding relationship, a covenant, with the Creator.
Okay, so you are either acting as a faithful covenant keeper, or you are in active rebellion as a covenant breaker.
Right, but you are never a neutral third party. This fundamentally changes the apologetic encounter.
Because you aren't trying to introduce a stranger to God.
No, you are confronting someone who is actively suppressing the truth about a God they already know.
Which means this entire conversational strategy is built on a massive bedrock of specific theology. You can't execute this method if you don't know the underlying theological mechanics.
Right. Farnham insists that apologetics must flow directly from theology.
So let's map that foundational bedrock. The sources start with what they call the creator-creature distinction, or the CCD.
And the creator-creature distinction is the absolute starting point for how knowledge works in this framework. It establishes a hard, unbridgeable boundary.
Meaning God is infinite, holy, and wholly other, while humanity is finite, limited, and created.
Exactly. Because of that infinite gap, human beings cannot reason their way up to God. A finite mind cannot comprehend an infinite reality simply by thinking harder.
But if that gap is unbridgeable from our side, how does anyone know anything about this God?
Well, the only way knowledge crosses that gap is if the infinite side initiates the contact. The theological term used here is condescension.
God must stoop down and reveal himself.
Yes. Therefore, in this system, human reason is never the ultimate authority. Divine revelation is. Our ability to know anything is completely dependent on God choosing to reveal it through Scripture or through the natural world.
Okay, so if God is the creator on one side of the distinction, we have to look at how this system defines the creature on the other side.
Which brings us to the doctrine of man.
Right, and the concept of the imago Dei, the image of God. The sources argue that humans aren't just highly evolved primates, but we are specifically engineered to reflect the divine.
And the author provides a really compelling way to visualize this concept. Imagine a soldier who is deployed in a hostile, miserable environment thousands of miles from his family.
Okay.
Tucked inside his gear, he carries a photograph of his wife. While he is in the trenches, he pulls that photo out constantly. He treasures it, he protects it, because looking at that image brings him joy and reminds him of the reality waiting for him.
But the photograph itself is just paper and ink. It's an icon, a reflection.
Precisely. Now, imagine that deployment ends. The soldier flies home, walks through his front door, and his wife is standing right there in the living room.
Right.
It would be an act of madness for him to walk past her, sit down on the couch, and stare at the wrinkled piece of paper. You don't obsess over the image when the reality is standing in front of you.
Wow. So in this theological framework, human beings are the photograph.
We are the paper and ink. We are the reflection. The imago Dei means that humanity was designed with rationality, morality, and relational capacity specifically so that we could function as mirrors, reflecting the glory of the Creator.
And because of that, we have immense value. I noticed the sources cite Genesis 9.6 to explain why murder is the ultimate crime, because striking a human is an attack on an effigy of the king.
Exactly, but the image is never meant to be the object of worship. If humans are designed as mirrors to reflect the I Am, then denying God isn't just an intellectual mistake in this framework.
It's a denial of one's own humanity. Okay, let me stop you right there, because this raises an enormous tension for me. If this framework claims that every human being is hardwired as an image bearer, equipped with a built-in capacity to know the Creator.
How does it explain the atheist?
Exactly. How does it explain the agnostic? If someone looks you in the eye and says, I have looked at the world, I have studied the sciences, and I honestly see zero evidence for a God, what is happening internally according to this system?
This is the crux of the entire presuppositional method. And to answer your question, the framework points directly to the doctrine of the fall and a specific text, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32.
Which serves as the ultimate psychological diagnosis for the secular mind.
Right.
And the diagnosis it offers is incredibly aggressive. Romans 1 essentially states that every single person on earth already possesses an ineradicable, undeniable knowledge of God.
Because they live in his world and are made in his image. The text says the truth is evident to them because God has shown it to them through the things that have been made.
Which means, in this framework, unbelief is never passive. It is never a case of innocent ignorance or insufficient data.
Exactly. The text describes unbelief as an active, ongoing suppression of the truth. It uses the language of exchanging the truth of God for a lie.
Okay, I need to push back hard on this. Are you saying that this framework demands the Christian view, a brilliant secular evolutionary biologist, someone who has spent 40 years studying material causes, as someone who secretly, deeply knows that a divine creator exists, but is just lying to themselves?
It is a profound friction point, yes.
Like, how does an apologist practically navigate a conversation with that premise without sounding incredibly condescending or dismissive of the other person's lived reality?
It requires such careful execution. The framework doesn't necessarily argue that the biologist wakes up every morning and consciously thinks, I know God exists, but I'm going to lie to the public today.
Okay.
It frames it as a deep, systemic, foundational self-deception. The psychological mechanism is compared to a person trying to hold a fully inflated beach ball underwater in a swimming pool.
Oh, man. It takes constant, exhausting effort. If you lose focus for a second, the ball shoots to the surface.
Exactly. The human mind, damaged by the fall, desires absolute autonomy. It does not want to be accountable to a holy creator. So the intellect goes to work constructing massive, complex, philosophical or scientific paradigms to keep the truth submerged.
The intellect basically becomes a defense attorney for a corrupt heart.
That's a great way to put it. The biologist isn't consciously lying in the moment. They are operating within a deeply ingrained presuppositional lens designed to filter out the divine.
But the beach ball is always fighting to come up.
It is. And when you suppress the truth of your own design, this framework argues that severe irrationality takes over.
Yeah.
You have to worship something because you are an image bearer designed for worship.
So if you suppress the creator, you will inevitably elevate something in creation to the status of ultimate reality.
Right.
The sources highlight an ancient example of this idolatry from the Old Testament that perfectly illustrates the psychological absurdity of it. It's striking.
The block of wood story.
Yes. The prophet Isaiah describes a man who goes into the forest and cuts down a tree. He takes half of the wood, chops it up, throws it in a fire to warm himself, and uses the coals to bake his bread.
Very practical.
Right. Then he takes the remaining half of that exact same piece of wood, carves it into a figure, bows down to it, and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God."
It is a devastating critique of human irrationality. The man knows the wood has no power. He just burned half of it to cook his dinner. The wood didn't bleed, it didn't cry out, it just burned like normal fuel.
Yet moments later, he treats the other half of the log as a sovereign deity.
And according to the psychological model in Romans 1, this isn't just an ancient problem. Modern people do the exact same thing, just with different materials.
What are the modern equivalents of the carved block of wood?
Well, human reason, the scientific method, political utopias, personal autonomy. People take things that are created, finite, and limited, and they rely on them to provide ultimate meaning, salvation, and moral order.
They're essentially asking the wood to save them.
Yes, they are.
What's fascinating about this psychological diagnosis is how the study guide frames the emotional impact of it. You would think that telling a Christian, hey, the person you are talking to has a corrupt heart, a damaged intellect, and is actively suppressing reality would be incredibly discouraging.
But the text actually frames this as deeply liberating for the ordinary Christian.
Right, because it removes an immense burden. If you adopt this framework, you suddenly realize that you do not have to prove that God exists.
The text claims the unbeliever already knows it deep down.
Exactly. The pressure to be an elite philosopher or a master historian evaporates. Your job isn't to impart new, undeniable evidence. Your job is simply to use diagnostic tools to point out that their beach ball is popping up to the surface.
You are exposing the suppression, not building the foundation.
But knowing that they're in an active state of suppression drastically changes how you have to approach them. I mean, if someone is fighting fiercely to keep that beach ball underwater, you can't just walk up and yell facts at them.
No, which transitions us perfectly into the posture of the messenger.
Right, if human stubbornness is this deeply entrenched, how does Farnham suggest a Christian actually approach them?
Well, the overarching strategy is termed premeditated evangelism. It requires intentionality, but it heavily emphasizes the tone mandated in 1 Peter 3.15, making a defense with gentleness and respect.
This is not about winning debates.
Not at all. Apologetics is a spiritual battle, sure, but the posture must be gentle. In fact, the sources explicitly define a common destructive phenomenon that happens when Christians get overly anxious about sharing their faith. They call it the gospel burp.
The gospel burp. It's such a visceral, slightly gross, but incredibly accurate metaphor. What exactly is the gospel burp?
It describes that awkward, nervous habit where a believer suddenly blurts out their entire theological presentation. So, sin, the cross, the resurrection, the need for repentance in one long, breathless monologue before they have asked a single question about the person standing in front of them.
It's the conversational equivalent of a drive-by shooting. You unload a rehearsed script, and you don't even stick around to see if it connected with their worldview.
Right. It usually stems from a sense of duty mixed with anxiety. The believer feels the pressure to get the gospel out, so they treat the unbeliever like a target rather than a person. They drop the payload and retreat.
To counter this anxiety-driven approach, the sources lay out 10 principles for effective encounters. We don't need to read all 10 like a grocery list, but the mechanics behind them are vital.
They focus on internal grounding, mostly. Having no fear because you understand the psychology of unbelief, remembering that Jesus is Lord over the conversation, and maintaining a genuinely winsome manner.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. The text highlights the concept of carrying a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other.
Yes, an old concept by the theologian Cornelius Van Til.
Right, the idea is that you use tattoos, t-shirts, or cultural events to transition into spiritual conversations. You find the connective tissue between their everyday secular life and the theological reality they are suppressing.
You use their environment to bridge the gap.
Farnham provides a brilliant real-world anecdote of this in action. He was on a flight, sitting next to a woman who was entirely engrossed in a novel. It happened to be The Da Vinci Code, which was a huge cultural phenomenon at the time.
Right, the Tom Hanks movie era.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of aggressively challenging her reading material, he utilized the Bible and newspaper concept. He just asked a simple, curious question like, I've seen that book everywhere. What is it actually about?
Which is an incredibly disarming approach. People love talking about what interests them. She enthusiastically explained the plot, detailing the book's premise that the early Christian church had fundamentally altered historical records.
And suppressed the truth about Jesus for political power.
Right, and right there she handed him the conversational bridge. By simply showing genuine curiosity about her book, they were suddenly engaged in a deep discussion about the reliability of the New Testament.
There was no forced pivot. It flowed naturally from her interests.
This raises an important question, though. How do we balance confidence in our message with genuine humility? Because maintaining that gentleness is hard when the other person starts saying things you fundamentally believe are false.
Oh, absolutely. The text explicitly warns against the argumentative mentality. Farnham shares a story about a student who asked him, in total seriousness, why he shouldn't just punch his conversation partner in the mouth when the guy was disrespecting his faith.
I mean, that is the ultimate failure of the method right there. If you resort to physical violence or even verbal aggression, you've abandoned the premise that this is a spiritual and intellectual rescue mission.
The goal, as defined by the Pocket Guide, is planting a stone in their shoe. You aren't trying to body slam them into an intellectual submission hold. You want to leave them with a thought they can't shake.
Rather than forcing a conversion on the spot.
Right. And how do we actually place that stone in their shoe? This brings us to the tactical core of the presuppositional method, which they call the indirect method.
Yes. Moving from the overarching posture to the actual tactical execution of the conversation. In a traditional debate, you lead with statements. I believe X because of Y.
But the indirect method turns the question mark into the primary weapon.
Exactly. You step into the role of a diagnostician. Instead of making statements, the goal is to ask sincere, probing questions to uncover the foundation of the unbeliever's worldview.
Because most people walk around with a patchwork of beliefs they picked up from culture, family, or media, and they have never bothered to see if those beliefs logically align.
Right. And the infographics included in our source stack offer a taxonomy for these conversations, outlining 5 themes to spark conversations.
They are broken down into universal human categories. You have Questions of identity. So who are you? Does life have meaning? And then questions of transcendence, like is there something beyond the physical universe?
The Pocket Guide suggests starting with very low-barrier preliminary questions. You ask things like, what is your religious background? Or what do you think is wrong with the world?
These questions invite them to speak freely without feeling like they are on trial. But the strategy quickly moves to advanced diagnostic questioning. This is where you walk down into their basement and start inspecting the concrete.
Right, forcing them to explain their own basis for logic and morality. The ultimate pressure test question is, what determines good and evil in your worldview?
Let's run a simulation of how this works, because the text frequently uses a secular paradigm it calls accidents of nature, or AN.
Okay, yes. This is a purely naturalistic, materialistic worldview. In AN, the universe began via unguided physical processes. Life emerged from non-life purely by chance.
And human beings are the result of millions of years of random genetic mutations favoring survival. So in the AN worldview, there is no designer, no ultimate purpose. A human being is just a highly complex biological machine.
Right. Cosmically speaking, we possess no more inherent significance than a snail.
Or a patch of moss. We are just matter in motion.
Exactly. So the apologist using the indirect method asks the person holding the AN worldview, I understand you believe we are the product of unguided random mutations. If that is true, how do you account for universal objective human rights?
Ooh, you are forcing them to reconcile their moral outrage with their materialistic premise.
Right. You ask, if we are just animals surviving, why is it objectively evil for a stronger human to kill and eat a weaker human rather than just a less socially optimal survival strategy?
Because if a lion kills a gazelle, we don't call it murder, we call it nature. So if humans are just advanced animals in a closed natural system, where does the concept of an objective moral law come from?
The presuppositionalist reveals that the unbeliever is borrowing moral capital from the Christian worldview. The skeptic is fiercely defending human rights and moral absolutes, concepts that only make sense if humans are made in the image of a moral creator.
They are living on a foundation they claim doesn't exist. But this leads to a critique of the method itself. If I am the skeptical listener, I might look at this indirect method and say, isn't it a bit manipulative to ask questions when you already have an agenda?
That is a highly common reaction. It feels like you are just acting like Socrates, setting intellectual traps.
Right.
But Farnham addresses this by insisting on the internal motivation of the Christian. The text frames this not as a trap, but as a genuine diagnostic tool.
A rescue operation.
Yes, you are clearing away the debris. By making them articulate why they believe what they believe, they often realize they don't have a solid foundation. You are guiding them to deconstruct their own commitment.
You are handing them the keys and letting them drive their own worldview until the wheels inevitably fall off.
But human beings don't usually enjoy having the wheels fall off their reality. They resist.
Which means the apologist has to navigate heavy psychological roadblocks. Even with great questions, conversations hit walls.
And the sources provide psychological strategies to navigate human stubbornness. They outline specific cognitive barriers that will inevitably trigger defensive reactions. The first is implicit bias.
Which is the natural reaction to being told you are wrong.
Right. When confronted with information that threatens our core understanding of reality, our psychological immune system kicks in. The hostility you face isn't necessarily a personal attack against you. It's the natural reflex of a mind trying to protect its equilibrium.
But the second, and perhaps most formidable barrier discussed, is the sunk cost fallacy. We hear this term in economics, but applying it to worldview theology is fascinating.
It really is. In economics, the sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to keep investing money into a failing business simply because you have already poured so much money into it.
You can't bear the thought that the previous investment was wasted, so you double down on a bad strategy. How does that map onto a philosophical conversation?
Well, imagine an academic who has spent 30 years building their career, writing books, and establishing their identity on a purely materialistic worldview. Or someone whose entire social circle is built around a shared rejection of religion.
If the diagnostic questions expose that their worldview is logically incoherent, conceding that point isn't just an intellectual shift. It requires abandoning the foundation of their identity.
Exactly. The cost of admitting the Christian worldview is true means admitting their life's work or their social standing was built on sand. That is a terrifying sunk cost to write off.
People will cling to an illogical premise with everything they have to avoid facing that kind of relational or professional bankruptcy.
Knowing that this sunk cost dynamic is in play is crucial for the Christian. It reinforces why patience is mandatory.
Yeah.
You are asking them to undergo a massive psychological paradigm shift.
This also informs how the method handles closed doors. The text provides a strategy for the moment when someone crosses their arms and says, look, I just don't like to talk about religion.
The amateur response is to push harder, or to awkwardly apologize and walk away.
Right, but the recommended strategy is a gentle, genuine probe. Just saying, oh, really? Why is that?
And that simple why is often the key that unlocks the real issue. The reluctance to talk about religion is rarely about a lack of intellectual interest in philosophy.
Almost invariably, that why uncovers a profound emotional wound. They might have grown up in an abusive church environment or had bad experiences with Christians.
Or they might be carrying the weight of the problem of evil, grief over suffering in the world. By asking why, you bypass the intellectual armor and engage the actual emotional barrier.
But eventually, once the ground is cleared, and once the indirect method has done its work exposing the flaws in the secular worldview, the strategy dictates a hard pivot. The diagnostic phase ends, and the direct method begins.
Yes. The text describes this phase using military language, destroying arguments, and pulling down strongholds. The Christian stops asking diagnostic questions and goes on the offensive.
And the script flips here.
It does. After the unbeliever's worldview is shown to lack a foundation for morality or logic, the Pocket Guide offers a specific question. You ask, would you agree that the Christian view of a rational, moral creator offers the only coherent explanation for logic, morality, and the uniformity of nature?
That is a staggering question to drop into a conversation. It creates an absolute binary choice.
It strips away the illusion that the unbeliever is standing on neutral, rational ground.
It says, look, you cannot explain human rights. You cannot explain the laws of logic using your accidents of nature framework. You have to choose, accept the Christian truth, or remain in irrationality.
It leaves them suspended in midair, realizing they have no foundation.
Which brings us to the final and most critical phase of the entire system, getting them to Jesus. Because if you just leave them in an existential crisis, realizing their worldview is absurd, you haven't actually accomplished the mission.
Right. Deconstruction without reconstruction is just intellectual vandalism. The ultimate goal of apologetics is not to win an argument about the philosophical preconditions of logic.
The deconstruction is merely the runway. The payload is the gospel.
And the sources provide a massive warning here about the danger of rabbit holes. When you have successfully dismantled someone's secular worldview, it is incredibly tempting to get sidetracked.
The human mind loves distractions. The unbeliever might try to pivot the conversation and ask, well, if God is real, what about the exact age of the earth? Or end times details, or cultural politics?
The text is adamant. Do not take the bait. Those debates do not save. You can argue about carbon dating for 6 hours, and even if you win, you haven't brought them an inch closer to redemption.
The focus must remain exclusively on the gospel. Jesus' claim to be God in the flesh, the cross, and the resurrection.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire apologetic endeavor is ultimately just a pathway to the cross.
Wow.
You contrast the hopeless narrative of accidents of nature with the Christian worldview.
Right. In A&N, humans are just a sum of genes, no more significant than a snail. The Christian worldview offers intrinsic value, but it demands repentance for sin against a holy God.
The intellectual heavy lifting is simply meant to remove the intellectual excuses, leaving the person face to face with the claims of Christ. It's a transition from practical theology back to personal redemption.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. What Mark Farnham's materials have mapped out is a radical departure from how most people argue about religion. Presuppositional apologetics refuses to play the game on the skeptics' terms.
It shifts apologetics from elite philosophical debates to grassroots conversational theology.
It insists that you must intimately know your own foundational doctrines, understand that human beings actively suppress uncomfortable truths, and use gentle diagnostic questions to reveal the cracks in secular worldviews.
All to clear the runway for the gospel.
Before we close, I want to address you, the listener, directly. Even if you are not coming from a Christian background, even if you reject every theological premise we've unpacked today, there's profound value in this indirect method.
Absolutely. Learning to ask people why they hold their foundational beliefs and examining your own presuppositions is a masterclass in critical thinking and empathy.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to chew on. We spent a lot of time today analyzing the sunk cost fallacy. and how it keeps people trapped in worldviews they can't rationally defend because their identity is wrapped up in them.
Right.
Take a hard, unforgiving look at your own deepest convictions, the beliefs that make your blood pressure rise when they are challenged. Are you holding on to those convictions because they are objectively true and coherent? Or simply because you've already spent your whole life building your identity around them?
It's a terrifying question to ask yourself.
When you find yourself on that stage with the spotlight in your eyes, asked to articulate the core of your reality, make sure you aren't just reciting a script someone else handed you. Make sure you actually know what is holding up the floorboards. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking big questions and seeking thorough answers.